Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I know I am competing, at least in the U.S., with a very momentous occasion. So thank you for tuning in. I am not going to have any slides. I'm going to just talk about who we are, what we do, and most importantly, why we do it. I am a physician. I was trained in internal medicine and was in private practice and academic medicine and public health for many years in New York. And as a physician, as a medical doctor, I was very used to seeing ill patients. I was very used to walk into the room, see a patient, take the history, examine the patient, formulate the diagnosis, differential diagnosis, order tests, start the treatment, and then monitor the course of the patient with various, tests and scans and whatever else is needed. And it was a very different experience when about 10 years ago now, my son went to college and came down crushing with severe depression and OCD. And at that time, I thought I wrote a lot of prescriptions for depression. I could definitely find help. How hard could it be? And it was not the case at all. So the more he was treated, although he was treated in some of the best hospitals in the U.S., the worse he was getting, and it was not the model, the medical model that I was used to. So I, as a mother and as a physician, I dropped everything and I started looking for answers. And on this path, I talked to everyone who would talk to me, and I met a lot of strangers, talked to a lot of friends. And what I realized on this path is that everyone had a story of their struggles with mental health care. What I've learned in these 2 years of trying to find help for my son, first, that the current treatments for depression and OCD are unacceptably, have unacceptably low efficacy. There is essentially a lack of convincing evidence for treatments, and beyond 1 or 2 initial medications, there is very little evidence of how to proceed with patients who become treatment resistant. And also, because it was in the U.S., the out-of-pocket cost was extremely high. And I was also thinking that I was in a much better position than many other families. I was a physician. I could take time off work to look for help. I could read and understand the literature. I could talk to people. I could talk to researchers and doctors. I could make informed decisions. And on this journey, I just kept thinking about the families that were not as essentially lucky as we were. So we started the company with a mission to find and accelerate patients' access to innovation in mental health. Although we are developing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, I think it's very important to say that we are not a psychedelic company. We are drug agnostic. If tomorrow there's something more promising than psilocybin appears, we will absolutely look at it. So, but how I came across research in psilocybin when I was, looking for all the solutions for my son, and I found a small study that was done at University of Arizona. It was 9 patients with treatment-resistant OCD. They all took psilocybin, and they all got better the next day. It was a very small, uncontrolled, short study with essentially no follow-up, but the signals were so promising. And considering all the suffering that I've seen in the previous years, we could not pay attention to the signals. So we started looking into ways of exploring whether this signals could be turned into treatments for patients who currently don't have any acceptable solutions. So let's talk a little bit about psilocybin therapy and psilocybin. Psilocybin is an active ingredient in some species of mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and it was first isolated by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in the 50s when he was a medicinal chemist at a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Sandoz. That was the time before modern regulations, before thalidomide came into play. And so essentially Sandoz synthesized psilocybin and shipped it to some psychologists, psychiatrists to share with them and said, look, we think we have something interesting here. Could you try it on your patients and report back to us? And that was the first time psilocybin as psychedelic was used in clinical practice. And you could potentially call it research, although it was not really a gold standard trials, but it was just a collection of a huge number of case studies. So the first kind of knowledge about how to use these substances started emerging back then. But then psilocybin escaped the lab and into the wild, and for the number of political and commercial reasons, psilocybin was pulled off the market by Sandoz and eventually rescheduled by the government and through UN convention. So one of the last people who did psychedelic research sessions in the U.S. was a very experienced therapist called Bill Richards, who did the last session at Spring Grove Psychiatric Institute in 1973, and the institute was then permanently closed, and Bill walked out of the door and thought that was the end of it. But a few decades later, he and Roland Griffiths, professor at Hopkins, got together and decided that it might be worthwhile to start looking at the potential, therapeutic potential of psilocybin and similar substances. So since that time, the psilocybin was used in small studies, small academic studies, for a variety of indications, including existential distress, patients with terminal cancer, life-changing diagnosis, severe anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, alcohol and tobacco addiction, and other indications. And there are many more studies are on in the workings. And from the variety of the studies, there was a pattern that emerged, that psilocybin caused rapid decrease of symptoms of depression, anxiety, OCD, and other symptoms that essentially happened the day immediately after the administration, the next day, and the effects were sustained for weeks, months, and sometimes forever for some patients. And that was after a single administration. So that, given the dire state of psychiatry and mental health care, it was impossible to ignore this signal. So the research continued. So psychedelics, it means mind manifesting, literally means mind manifesting. So people who ingest magic mushrooms or patients who take psychedelics in research settings would have unusual visions, memories of distant events, often with strong emotional undertones, sometimes blissful, sometimes pleasant, sometimes horrifying. They would have realizations, newly found appreciation for life. And such experiences, because magic mushrooms and other psychedelics were used in indigenous societies for centuries prior to modern research, such experiences were considered sacred by indigenous societies and unusual and, if not undesirable, by Western standards. But that was probably because we didn't really understand how psilocybin works. So now with the advances of neuroscience, science in general, and particularly with invention and advances in neuroimaging and invention of functional MRI, we started to understand the mechanism of action of psilocybin and kind of demystify all the mystical experiences. So what we know is that psilocybin activates the serotonin system in the brain, and it works on a set of receptors. So serotonin in general is critical to regulation of mood and cognition. And when psilocybin activates serotonin receptors, it sets off a cascade of neurochemical events that are now thought to be partially responsible for its antidepressant effect. But that's just part of the story. And psilocybin binds preferentially to a type of serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A receptor, which is particularly densely expressed in the area of the brain called default mode network. Default mode network is not an anatomical area, but a system of functional connections unique to each person that is formed based on this person's life experiences, learning, environmental, and other factors. It constitutes essentially our sense of self, or it essentially is a collection of cognitive, emotional, behavioral patterns, and you can call it sense of self or sense of ego. And when psilocybin activates 5-HT2A receptors, it downregulates the default mode network, so it goes quiet. This downregulation leads to the experience, the so-called peak experience that could be described as unitive, non-dual, or ego dissolution experience. This is the holy grail of psychedelic experience. And such experiences allow people to look, because patients or people who take psychedelics are temporarily lifted out of the clutches of their egos, of their sense of self. It allows them to look at their personal narratives, their life events, their conflicts from a new and different vantage point, not only from the perspective of entrenched patterns or old depressed thinking. And potentially with a skillful integration of such experiences, the new patterns of functional connectivity could emerge in the brain, across the brain regions. So because of the combination of psychopharmacological and subjective psychological effects, psilocybin can only be administered in conjunction with psychological support, skillful psychological support, I should say. This is critically important because the psychological support is currently thought to be as important as pharmacological effects of psilocybin itself. And in our clinical development program, it's administered by specially trained, experienced therapists. So while we understand the subjective experience and the psychopharmacological effects, it's really not enough to make these treatments available to patients. So we are currently in phase 2B clinical trials, which is a dose-finding study when we're looking at different doses, their effects, safety, and efficacy of 3 different doses. So the patient's journey in the trial, in clinical trial, looks like that. When patients come in and are enrolled in clinical trials, they meet with a dedicated therapist. They meet with a therapist for a couple of times prior to the treatment session. These sessions are essentially spent, the preparation session, the therapeutic goal of preparation session is to establish what's called a therapeutic alliance. And essentially that's a sense of trust between the patient and the therapist. So patients learn about what to expect in psilocybin experience, and the therapists learn about the patient and what could potentially come up in psilocybin experience and how to best support patients. So they establish this sense of trust. And then on the day of the session, patients come into the treatment room. We take the treatment rooms at all of our 20-something sites, and we turn the typical hospital room into a non-clinical environment. We put a living room type of furniture, ambient lighting, flowers, and things like that. So it's very soothing, non-clinical, non-stimulating environment. Patients take psilocybin as a capsule, and put on the eye shades, lie down on the couch or in the bed, and listen to the specially designed playlist. And playlist is designed to follow the pharmacodynamic of the drug. So in the beginning, it's a little more emotionally evocative, and then progressively becomes calmer and calmer. So, and the therapist stays with the patient throughout the entire session, and in case patients need any support or become anxious, distressed, therapists are trained to support patients to make sure that they're safe and have a meaningful and safe experience. And the next day, so at the end of the session, patients, the acute effects of the drug wears off. Patients are assessed for safety and they go home. They don't stay in the hospital overnight. They come back the next day to meet with the therapist again for about an hour and a half to talk about their experience, what if they gain any insights. And again, therapists are trained to help patients to integrate their experiences into more productive and more helpful cognitive behavioral, create some cognitive behavioral changes. So what have we learned in the process of conducting these clinical trials and treating patients? So first of all, we've learned that of course the therapy aspect is very important, and the training of therapists is extremely important. And our training of therapists is intense and labor intense and time intense, but we believe that it's really, really important. So it's also for the purpose of shared consistency between clinical sites. We need to make sure that all the therapists support patients in a similar manner. It's also extremely important. The psychotherapeutic support is extremely important because part of the appeal of psilocybin is that it creates what patient describes as a new sense of agency. It changes their relationship with symptoms. Some patients say that even if symptoms of depression come back, they have a sense of separation from the symptoms. They don't fuse with the symptoms, and they can choose to engage or not to engage. And they can choose to even live along the side of symptoms of depression or symptoms of OCD. So this newfound sense of agency, this kind of shift of locus of control from a psychiatrist, psychologist, mental health professional to the patient is extremely important and valued, highly valued by patients. And also the other thing is that was really not really surprising, but was super helpful, is that the regulators, and we have talked to the regulators in 13 different countries, all regulators were extremely well informed about the research, excited about the research, and really motivated by finding solutions for patients who don't have any any effective treatments at the moment. And our program was granted breakthrough therapy designation by FDA, which means that FDA sees an enormous potential in this treatment and is willing to work with us to help us design the trials, design the clinical development program that will answer the questions they might have at the end of the program in order to expedite the approval of this treatment. But the other thing that is super important that I've, based on our experience with access to mental health care, is that regulatory approval is really just the first step. And if we really want to ensure patients' access to innovation, we absolutely need to make sure that treatment, should the science hold and the treatment is approved by the regulators, that this kind of treatments are integrated with national care guidelines and reimbursed. So the patients who don't have the means do not have to access it, don't have to pay, that it's reimbursed and accessible to anyone regardless of their ability to pay. And creating this evidence for payers is equally challenging, if not more challenging, than creating the regulatory quality evidence. So we're working closely with regulators and payers to understand what they would want to see in order for this treatment to become available if the trials are successful. So any innovation is really only, essentially it's an invention and operationalization of this invention, and it's of any value to patients only if they can access it. So we're working very closely, again, with payers to understand the pricing and how make it available to patients. So to bring it back to close it, I just want to say that my son today is doing well. He recovered. He is in long-term relationship. He has a rewarding job and happy. But that's just a story of one family. It's just one person, and there is a promise in psychedelic therapy, but we're not quite there yet. We need to create the evidence. We need to get it through the regulatory and payer process, and we need to continue to bring this treatment to as many patients as possible. So that's my talk today, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share it.